But welcome everyone. I'm Diane. I'm the executive director for National Garden Bureau. With me, I have Gail, who is
Sorry.
here, and she's managing everything behind the scenes, and she's the one to thank for you finding out about this webinar. We have two panelists, and I will introduce those in just a minute. I wanted to give everybody my one little tip here about a webinar that if you go into your upper right corner on view and put speaker view, then you are actually going to see the person who is talking. And that makes it a little bit easier. And somebody has already jumped on the chat. And thank you, Linda, to the question. It was about whether or not this will be recorded, and it will be. And then we'll put it on our YouTube. Plus, we will hopefully this afternoon or tomorrow send an email out to everybody who registered with a link to that recording with some additional little resources we have. So throughout this, as you have questions, please post them in the chat and we will follow along. If you post a question that I already have on my list in the proper order, I will wait, but we will definitely try to get to all of your questions. And so, with that, I am very excited to introduce our panelists. We have Georgia from Monrovia and Christina from Proven Winners. So, I will let each of them introduce themselves. So, Georgia, I'm going to hand it over to you to tell a little bit about yourself and your company.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. So my name is Georgia. As Diane mentioned, I am the new plants manager at Monrovia. Basically, it just means that my job is to work with breeders. We trial plants at all four of our nurseries, and then I help bring those plants to market. Monrovia, if you're not familiar, is a wholesale nursery. We grow plants for the whole United States and into Canada. I mentioned we have four nurseries, one in Cairo, Georgia, Connecticut, Visalia, California, and Dayton, Oregon, where I am located.
Awesome. Lucky you living in Oregon. I guess we all have good things about wherever we live, right? It depends
Yeah.
on the time of year. Okay, great. And Christina, let's hear a little bit about you. You are Georgia has been on our webinars a few times. Christina, this is your first, so no pressure whatsoever. I'm sure you'll do a wonderful job, but welcome. And can we learn a little bit more about you?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm excited. Definitely love lilacs and I'm excited to talk about them. So I'm from Spring Meadow Nursery, a wholesale nursery as well. We are actually behind the Shrub branch of Proven Winners. There are a couple different partners, but we manage the shrubs. So any of the hydrangeas, roses, lilacs that you've seen from Proven Winners, we've actually trialed and tested, maybe even bred here in Michigan. And I manage, I'm a horticulturist here and I manage customer experience. So I manage our social media and I answer a lot of customer questions. I also answer questions on the Proven Winners website. So if you've ever typed in, oh my gosh, something's going on, if it was a shrub question, I answered it. So definitely looking forward to helping everybody their lilacs.
Awesome. Well, as you can tell, we have two very well-informed, well-versed panelists that I think are pretty excited about lilacs. Also, perfect time of year. I mean, around here, I'm in Chicago, so the lilacs are in full bloom right now. So I'm probably going to have most of these questions, and hopefully you can answer them. So let's just kind of start a little bit about the history of lilacs. What both of your companies are doing now as far as breeding work. What are some of the needs from consumers and from retailers? What are you working on to deliver the more successful plant to the home gardener? So yeah, I'll toss it. Either one of you can start.
Well, I'd love to just talk about, I mean, everybody who lives in a warmer zone is asking for lilacs. So that's something that we're definitely working on. Lilacs that need fewer cooling days so that they can actually succeed in those warmer zones. I know we were just talking about zone 8 lilacs before you all joined us. So that's definitely something we've been working on. Obviously, disease resistance is always important, but what about you, Georgia?
Yeah, I'd agree with that totally. And especially as you get into those warmer zones, making sure that they don't get powdery mildew with the humidity, things like that. Also seeing a lot of people wanting shrubs that are just generally easier to manage. So smaller shrubs that you can fit into containers or closer in to like your patio area so you can enjoy the fragrance. And then fragrance, obviously upping the fragrance, upping the bloom time so you get longer blooms, and reblooming is really great if you're in a zone that is long enough season to get the rebloom. We're always looking for that too.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the reblooming? What maybe even which varieties are good rebloomers? Both of you can talk about that.
Yeah, so reblooming, so that behind me is our little darling lilac. That's an example of a reblooming variety. So it blooms once in the spring and then it blooms again towards the end of the summer. Some people I do know, you hear reblooming and their season is so short that unfortunately they can't get that second bloom in. But if you do have a longer season, you can get that second bloom.
So does that go
So
according to zone maybe? Like I'm zone 5, I'm in Chicago. First frost is going to be in the first 2 weeks of October. So would I be able to get it to rebloom?
Most likely, yes.
yeah.
But everyone's little climate is slightly different.
Yeah.
So I know for our reblooming lilacs, the bloomerang series, it's kind of like you throw the boomerang, then it comes back to you later on in the season. Ours are both hybrids, so they are just little pieces of magic. Georgia knows a lot more about the breeding side than I do, but it's a little bit of that breeding magic that makes them able to have that beautiful show and then do it again on new wood later in the season.
Yeah,
Okay.
it is important to note. I will say, I know that it's been tripping up some consumers. You do need to deadhead usually that first bloom set off before you get that second bloom. So that's a key piece to getting your lilac to rebloom. Although that's another breeding objective. No deadheading.
Right. And it's I don't know if we'll talk about it later, but the earlier that you get that spent bloom off, is you're going to get that rebloom a lot faster. So if you're worried about that window of time, like, am I going to get the rebloom? Am I not? Definitely get out there and get to that task quickly so that the plant has enough time to make that new growth, which will then produce the bloom.
Okay, so I was going to save a lot of our pruning discussion for the end, but I want to make sure that we kind of circle back to the reblooming varieties versus non-reblooming. So help me remember that when we get to the pruning aspect. But you were talking about reblooming, and I know that there's a lot of different types of lilacs. So does one of you want to talk a little bit about the different types, or maybe one of you takes 4 or 5 and the other can take 4 or 5, because I know that there are a ton of different lilacs.
Yeah, there are a ton of different species of lilacs. Some of the most popular, there's Syringa vulgaris, which is our common lilac. We were talking about blue skies and lavender lady and sensation. Those are sort of the larger plants, like 10 plus feet tall usually. Really awesome fragrance for late spring. There's also the patchouli variety, so the Korean lilacs. A lot of the varieties on the market, like Miss Kim, that's really popular. That's a patchouli variety. Tons of hybrids, as Christina mentioned, the hybrids. And then of course, you've got your tree lilacs, your reticulatas. There's just a ton.
I would love to mention about fragrance, because that's what we all are looking for with a lilac. The Hyacinthiflora is an amazing lilac for fragrance. So that's like the Centaura lilacs are like going to be one of the most like powerful. You walk outside, it's a hot day, it greets you as you exit. So that's the Hyacinthiflora.
So you're saying that one would be the most fragrant?
I would say fragrance is all objective. It's what you think, but like of the lilacs, I think there are about 25 different main species. So of the 25, it's one of the top ones for powerful fragrance.
And are you guys, each respective company, working on one species more than another? Is it based on popularity or I don't know what?
I think we're probably just got a lot of balls in the court, trying out every avenue.
Awesome. Okay. There was a question about fragrance. Are different colored lilacs more fragrant than others?
Yeah, I've heard that white lilacs are less fragrant. To my experience, that seems to be true. But to me, they're still fragrant. So it's hard to answer that question. But I do think the white is generally just the least fragrant of them all.
Yeah, I think it's like the darker color lilacs are always like, that's the common, oh, the dark purple ones are the most fragrant. And I don't know. I guess my nose is just happy wherever it gets to be in a lilac. So
Any lilac scent is a wonderful scent, right? A related question, since lilacs are fragrant, are they deer resistant? And I will kind of preface your answers because we get this all the time on our webinars. The panelists always say, well, it depends. So anyway, I will let you guys answer that about deer resistance. If they are deer resistant, is because of the fragrance or is it for some other reason?
So I would say we love to use the Rutgers scale because it was really heavily researched. It's a really nice scale if you want to be able to look up any plant. So on the Rutgers scale, lilacs get from A to D, they get a B. So it really is just one of those toss-up plants. Maybe in your area, deer are, they've got more of a buffet and they won't really bother your lilacs, but they could also just decide, wow, that is so tasty. So it's kind of deer resistant. What about you? What do you think, Georgia?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. It totally depends who you ask. You're right that usually fragrance like rosemary and herbs and strong scents, deer tend to shy away from. But I've known a deer to eat a lilac or two in my backyard.
So I had not heard of this Rutgers study. Christina, could you talk a little bit more about that? And I assume A is not deer resistant and D is, or is it vice versa?
So it's opposite. So A means like, wow, this has received very little damage from deer. And D is that it is bothered by deer. Deer really like to eat that thing. So it looks like the link is in the chat.
Excellent.
But it's a really good resource for most shrubs, most common ones anyway.
Awesome. Yes. Somebody says Rutgers grad. So they posted that link. We would recommend you clicking that link and saving it. We will put that in our follow-up email because I had never heard of that. So that is really good to know. Thank you for bringing that up. Now there was another question about, oh boy, now we're going to have a whole Rutgers thing going here on the chat. That's awesome.
Sorry.
That's really good. No, that's good. I love it. I love
when you
the
find a
alumni.
good resource, you have to share it.
That's right. Very good. So somebody had just questioned, tree or shrub. Is there certain varieties that are better if you want to? I mean, I know that some of them grow larger and some of them grow smaller. Tree or shrub or standard. Talk about the different. We talked about the different types, so maybe the different forms. And is it hard to make some of these forms in your own home garden? Do you buy them that way? What's your recommendation?
So you can do, go ahead, Christina.
No, you're so good. You go.
Okay, so yeah, obviously, like I mentioned, Syringa reticulata, that is just naturally a tree lilac. So if you're looking for a smaller tree, 20 to 25 feet, that's going to naturally want to do that, go for that. They're also super hardy. I think they're hardy to zone 3, which is great. But most that you'll find on the market are shrubs. So like those Patio varieties, the hybrids, they have multiple woody stems. If you were so inclined, you could, I guess, take from a Bulgaris might be good because it's taller and larger. You could choose a single stem and keep pruning. It's a labor of love and just see how that goes for you. Or there are patio tree forms, which is, we grow, like I mentioned, Little Darling, we grow that on a patio tree form, which is basically just on a standard. We've done the work for you of choosing that leader. So then you get a nice tree form on something that would normally be a small shrub.
I would also add that some of those shrubs that get a little bit larger, if you really like the multi-stem tree look of like an amelanchier or something like that, you could just kind of take the foliage up off the bottom and over time give it kind of like a really elegant multi-stemmed look. I've seen done really well. It just takes, like you said, time and effort.
So you have to be pretty passionate about what you're doing, it sounds like. There's a good question here. I have a Korean dwarf lilac palabend that I've had in pots for 3 years. It's doing well except for basil sprouts from the bottom of the pot. Can I keep it in pots forever, or at some point do I need to transplant it to in-ground?
So you can definitely transplant it from pot to pot to pot, but each time you do that, it's going to need to get either a little bit like a little larger, or you're going to have to do some pruning of those roots. You're going to want to refresh the potting soil just because it's going to run through it. I would say it's definitely possible to keep a dwarf plant in a container. You're just probably going to have to size up.
Yeah, I would agree. The lilac roots are pretty expansive. So if you think about it, they're a little bit wider than the plant themselves. So if you're using that as your gauge, you could just, you always want the pot to be a little bit wider than the plant itself, just because of the way that the roots are.
And what about overwintering then? We had a container webinar not too long ago, and it was interesting that they said, for example, I'm in zone 5. Well, then I should make sure that I buy a plant that's hardy to zone 4. So like bump up a zone. Is that true for lilacs also, if you wanted to get them to overwinter in a container? Or I don't know, maybe you need to address it zone by zone, what you might need to do to get it to overwinter.
Yeah, I think that you're right. If you're in a zone 4, your safest bet, absolute very conservative would be a zone 6. But there are definitely other ways. Zone 5 would work as well. You just want to, your roots are not in, soil is such a good insulator. And so that's what, makes it really hardy. But when they're up and above in a pot, they're going to be way colder than they would be in the ground. But there are ways to do it. You can bury your pot in the soil if you want. You can wrap it up in burlap and, do other ways. But if you're just going to leave it out, yeah, I would do a zone at least above what your hardiness zone is.
Any other?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Well, we're going to go now about the best places to grow lilacs, or the best growing conditions, what kind of soil, what's the sun requirements. Maybe one of you takes soil and one of you takes sun.
So I definitely feel like sun is the biggest problem for lilac growers, full stop. Just because it really needs that absolute full sun, which we classify as at least 6 hours of direct sunlight on it. And that's going to make sure that you aren't dealing with those horrible diseases that just creep up on you when you realize, oh shoot, am I growing this in part shade? Usually if somebody messages me about a plant question like, oh, it's not blooming, oh, it's got this disease, it's this or that, like usually the main culprit is sun. So if you think, okay, I want to try to put a lilac here and it might not get full sun, I would just say don't do that. It really is a plant that needs full sun. So
yeah, and then to the soil, they prefer neutral, even slightly alkaline soil. So if you do have acidic soil, you can always put, I think, bone meal is an okay treatment to use to slightly alkalize your soil. So it's neutral to slightly alkaline.
And I would also say the type of soil, it really is a plant that loves good drainage. It's like worst enemy is getting soggy feet. You're just going to end up dealing with a lot of problems if your lilac is sitting in water. So
they don't want those wet feet. So, okay, that's good. So neutral or slightly acidic soil that drains well, and full sun at least 6 hours a day.
Yep.
Okay. What about fertilization? New lilacs, older lilacs, established lilacs? What is your recommendation?
They really don't need a lot of feeding. They actually, a lot of, you think nitrogen fertilizer, but nitrogen can inhibit flowering in lilac. So if you're over fertilizing, you can create more vegetative growth and they won't flower as well. The best time to do it is late winter, early spring, if you're going to do it. And, you don't want to do it right away. Maybe a couple-year-old plant could benefit from a little bit of fertilizer. But again, you just want to be really careful that you're not overfeeding, because you can really reduce the amount of flowers.
If you've noticed like diminished flowering with your plant, if you know that you have really nutrient poor soil, if you've done a soil test, which I think you guys have probably talked about 100 million times, but soil tests are great for knowing what's going on. But if you've noticed you have really nutrient poor soil, you could get a fertilizer that's for flowering shrubs that has that higher middle number, so the NPK, so that it would actually encourage the production of flower buds. But otherwise, like you said, it's a really classic plant that is just very good at chugging away without a lot of additional help.
And I did not plug you to say that, but my next question was about plugging away. How long does it take for a lilac to get established, start blooming, reach full height? How many years would that be in an average condition?
Well, dang, that's a really hard question because it just depends so much on the lilac itself. Yeah, I think the shortest amount of time it's going to take for a lilac to get its roots established is really just like that year-ish, 2-year-ish window, that mystical time. And then sometimes a lilac might not flower really well until it's been in the ground for a couple of years. I know there's some older varieties that will last like 7 years before they even like whisper a bloom into existence. So I personally haven't seen any like one answer for that question, but what about you, Georgia?
Yeah, totally agree with that completely. Lilacs are one of those plants that have the juvenile stage where they're only focused on growing, not flowering in any way, shape, or form. I think most of the newer hybrids, a lot of the newer varieties are shaving that time off. So, the oldies, like you mentioned, 7 years, 5 years, and now we're seeing blooms in their first or second year for a lot of these newer varieties. And usually what you buy at the garden center is already mature in a flowering age. So just be looking for those buds, looking for those flowers if you want that instant satisfaction.
That's a good point, because yeah, I was just at a garden center over the weekend and I couldn't believe how many of them were already in bloom and they were still in their pots. And so it's great because then you can buy it and have that immediate gratification, which a lot of us want these days. So we were talking about blooms. So can we talk about when they typically bloom? I think we all know that, but is it dependent on sunlight, or is it dependent on ground temperatures, air temperatures? What triggers a lilac to bloom?
So lilacs need cold winters to bloom. That's why they're traditionally set aside for those northern climates. So they bloom in the spring, so it's not heat. We know that it is sunlight, I believe. Christina, I could be wrong about that trigger, but I'm pretty sure that's right.
That sounds right to me. I figured, you know what? I'm going to leave this one to Georgia because you asked. We know that they bloom in the spring, but I actually don't know if it's soil or soil temperature or sun. So I could definitely ask one of the horticulturists here to see.
We'll get that exact answer and we will put it in our follow-up email. And I have to tell everybody, I kind of pulled that one out of the blue and tossed it at you without any prior preparation. So my apologies on that, but I just thought it was interesting. It's like, okay, well, what
Oh,
is
it
it?
is.
Yeah, it is interesting. Going back to fertilizer, somebody just asked, which of the 3 letters of fertilizer needs to be higher for blooms? Because I think you said one of them should be lower, but
so it's the highest one should be the middle number. So it's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so nitrogen, like Georgia was saying, is the one that you want to be high if you want to encourage foliage. which you obviously don't here at the expense of bloom and bud development, but the middle number is what you want to be the highest.
Excellent.
Fun fact, you'll often notice that the last number is highest for starter fertilizers to get those roots established. So
excellent tidbit. What about my lilac is not blooming? What would you say is probably the number one answer? I think you already said it earlier, of why my lilac isn't blooming.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that there are, Christina is not getting enough sun. That's a big one. Also pruning at the wrong time. I know a lot of the general idea is you prune when things are dormant, and that can be an issue with lilacs. You want to prune right after that first bloom set, because they do bloom on old wood. They set their buds right after that first bloom, so you want to deadhead and prune at that time and not when they're dormant, because you'll cut off all the blooms.
Okay, that's good. So you mentioned
So I would also,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, there's also one other, because those are the two biggies. And I think sometimes if a lilac gets really stressed out, it's not getting enough water, it's getting too much water. It'll just get really stressed, and then it won't perform at its peak. So the best way to ensure that you're going to have a flowering lilac is to make sure that it's growing vigorously throughout the whole summer, because that's when it's working to develop those flower buds.
Good tip. So you said deadhead, and then we were also talking about pruning. So can we just elaborate a little bit more on timing for deadheading, which I heard was right after it finishes blooming, and then pruning. So is that done at the same time? So basically late spring, early summer, right after they bloom, is that the best time to prune the entire plant?
So I would say that if you're doing more of like a maintenance pruning to help, you've noticed that your plant is really prone to like powdery mildew, perhaps. You might do a maintenance prune earlier while it's still dormant and kind of thin it out a little bit because you're not going to want to encourage new growth at those places at all. So when you're pruning when the plant is dormant, it's not going to go, oh wait, I'm going to produce 5 branches in this one branch's place, and now you've got like quadruple the problem. So if you're going to do some maintenance pruning, I would recommend doing that in the late winter when the plant is doing nothing. But yeah, Georgia said you're going to want to deadhead right after those blooms have spent, because this plant is really quick at developing flower buds.
Yeah, and I would just say, if you have, I know a lot of people, myself included, have, those 20-year-old lilacs that have been sort of neglected and are kind of huge and rangy. And that would be the time if you wanted to do a big prune to sort of rejuvenate that plant. Yeah, I would totally agree with Christina that you'd want to do that while it's dormant, just so that, when you're doing those big cuts like that, you really want to make sure the plant is dormant. But other than that, if you've been pruning really, every year or every other year and really maintaining the shape, you can do it after when you're deadheading in the spring.
Okay, so you had mentioned 20-year lilacs. I think we've got 2 questions here about people who have 30-year-old lilacs. So this is awesome. Okay, so in one instance, she says, I have a 30-year-old lilac that is slowly moving into the raspberry patch. What's the best way to cut back a large section of those suckers short of bringing in a backhoe?
Well, if they're just the suckers, man, the backhoe might be your best bet, or your shears, cutting them off at the base. You can always transplant those too if you want. I don't know, if you want your lilac to be somewhere else, those suckers can be transplanted, but really it's about just cutting them off or digging them up would be your best bet, unfortunately.
Not an easy answer for that one at all, but it's just true.
Yeah, and then here's another one that's 30 years old. It has vertical branches coming from the trunk. Should I leave them?
I mean, aesthetically, new growth that is wildly different from your gorgeous old gnarly plant. I would personally get rid of them just to save that kind of like beautiful architectural feature, but I don't know of any. I'm gonna admit it. I don't know if there's any harm. Georgia, do you know?
No, not really. Actually the newest growth, the youngest shoots are going to be the most vigorous for flowering. And so it really depends on what direction you want to take your lilac. Do you want to, tone it down and maybe start afresh with these new shoots that are coming off? Or do you like that, large multi-branched look, and do you want the new shoots to be closer to the top? But really keeping your new growth, keeping it fresh is going to keep the flowers really strong. So just think about what aesthetically what you kind of are looking for, and either go with that or take it off and try the new growth at the top.
So, what about the amount, like the max amount that you should prune? A lot of us have heard anywhere from, a quarter to a third of the plant is what can be removed every year. Does that hold true for lilacs? And which is it? One third or one quarter, or is it less or is it more?
I think this is one of those ones where it really depends on who taught you. I've always heard a quarter. I've always heard to be more conservative with a lilac than some of the other ones that can take like a butchering, like a panicle hydrangea. But I mean, what do you think, Georgia?
Yeah, it's funny because I've always heard a third.
Yeah, right.
So I think that really whatever you're comfortable with, a quarter or a third, probably the best way to go. So it's going to be a long process to do that, but every year if you remove a third, in 3 years theoretically you'll have a rejuvenated shrub. It might not flower as well until it's fully rejuvenated because you are taking off so much of those buds, but it's worth it because they look really great when they're all fresh and rejuvenated.
So you just have a little phase to go through, but yes, like you say, it's worth it.
Yeah.
Another question about what is the latest date I should prune for a lilac that bloomed in April? I think their question
Well,
might be,
that's
is
tough.
it too late now because it's mid-May? Or should I go ahead?
Well, okay, so that is really location dependent. I would love it if we could talk, all of us lived in the same area and we could talk about months so clearly. But here in Michigan, I am still seeing mostly lilac, like flower buds, whereas I know that there are a lot of places where they're already spent. So it really depends on the lilac itself and where you live. If the lilac has been spent quite a while ago, I would say that you probably don't want to prune it just because you're going to remove those flowers. But
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would, usually it's within that couple week, maybe a month window. And if you're anywhere past that, you run the risk of cutting off next year's flowers, which would be sad.
Exactly. And okay, so I said I was going to circle back to this question. We were talking about reblooming lilacs in the beginning. So now let's kind of like bring this all together. Reblooming versus traditional lilacs. With reblooming lilacs, I think you said same thing, trim them, deadhead them right after they bloom, correct?
Mhm.
Okay. And then what do you do about the late summer, early fall blooms? Do you have to prune or deadhead those also?
Yes, the
it's
same
nice
thing.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. And you really don't have to, we say deadhead and like, what does that mean? Are you going below? Are you going, it's really like the topmost set of leaves. It's really just taking off that wilted flower cluster. And yeah, I would do it after that summer bloom as well.
Okay. So hopefully we answered your question about pruning and for regular lilacs and reblooming ones. Somebody asked about tools. What do you recommend? Shears, a little clippers? Does it depend on the size of the lilac, the size of the stems or branches? What's some of your recommendations?
If you've got a manageable lilac, I would always recommend bypass pruners just because those are such a clean cut. I guess if you had a really massive lilac, I shudder to think about, I mean, personally, like taking a pair of shears, but I've seen people do it. Yeah. What do you think, Georgia?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're trying to prune out. I will use my 20-year lilac as the example, and I've been doing my third. I'm in year 2, and I had to break out a little saw because the stems were so thick. So I think it really depends on what you're trying to do.
The right tool for the right job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the best advice there.
Yeah.
So you guys, you mentioned powdery mildew. So we want to talk about some of the problems that some of lilacs might face. And I think powdery mildew is the most common. So I know the new varieties that are coming out are resistant. So we will encourage everybody, well, to buy some of the newer ones, but we all have older lilacs also. So how would you treat powdery mildew, or what would you do to prevent it in your current old 20, 30-year-old lilacs?
Yeah, so the powdery mildew will show up, the weather's humid or it's really wet, or maybe you're overwatering. Some of that stuff you can control, like the overwatering, some of it you can't. The humidity, you don't have any control. So really it's about ensuring good air circulation. So when you're going through and pruning, you're thinking about the air circulation. So keep making sure that things are relatively open and breathable. You also, if you do notice powdery mildew, it's more of an aesthetic issue than anything else, but you want to remove the plant debris from the bottom, because it is something that overwinters in that debris. So as much as you can get out, the better.
Yeah, definitely worth it to pick up all of those fallen leaves in the fall. And I know that it's mostly an aesthetic issue, but if it happens to get really bad earlier in the season, and you are seeing it kind of out of control, I generally don't love to recommend using chemicals, but I think if it were a really prolific event, you'd probably want to treat it, just because when powdery mildew gets really bad, it does prevent some photosynthesis there, so your plant could suffer. It's not very common, but just that caveat: if it happens in the spring and it's really bad, you might want to do something about it. But usually it happens later on in the season when it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of sad to see.
Okay, so that's powdery mildew. We've got some people asking about scale. Is that a common problem on lilacs? And I think somebody is asking specifically about oyster shell scale, if you can say that 3 times. So what's your advice there?
Well, I wouldn't say, I don't think it's a common problem. It's not something that I hear of often, if ever. But if you're having scale, then it's obviously a problem in your climate. And I would say, some of the best advice you can get for your local climate is at your local garden center. And they will probably have an awesome resource, or, if you needed to spray or do something with the scale, they'd probably be able to point you in the right direction with that.
Yes.
Okay. You agree with that one. Yes, I agree about going to your local garden center. Your local extension office also would be the best resource to know exactly what's happening in your area. Okay, I'm looking at some of questions. What about transplanting lilacs? Is there like a certain age or size where it's probably not recommended anymore? What's your recommendations there?
So I would say, if you're considering transplanting something, it's because you do not like it where it is. So if you're going to get rid of it, if you don't like it there, unless it's one of those gnarly 20-year-old ones, I would say it's worth it to try to transplant something, and you would do that in the springtime. You would want to prune it back pretty considerably, just to kind of remove the burden from those roots to try and support a really large plant. But yeah, I would say definitely in the springtime, and don't hurt yourself. But in my opinion, it's worth a try. But what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think typically people try to transplant them before the leaves appear in the spring. So on the earlier side of spring, yeah, it's possible to transplant the larger ones. It's just going to be sort of a bear. Like we mentioned, the root system is quite large, and the plants themselves can be quite large, but the smaller variety should be okay. And then again, those root shoots, so those sort of annoying that's going into the garden in one of the listeners' gardens, those root shoots can be transplanted as well. So that's a little bit easier of a way to move plants from one place to another.
Okay, great. Along that same theme, so you had talked about the suckers or root shoots. Can you take stem cuttings to make new plants? And then I'm going to follow up with, should you? Is that just a lot of work and a long time to get a shrub of any size?
First, I would love to say the annoying thing, which is that on a lot of plants you can propagate them, but some plants are just illegal to propagate. So I just figured I'd put that out there. And I think a lot of times when people are talking about lilacs, they really want them to grow quickly and to be there already. So most of the time it's worth it to just buy the plant. Just because it takes a long time to just, I don't know. But for the joy of gardening, you can do that.
Yeah, you can do that if you're so inclined, you could definitely give it a try.
Again, for those who are so inclined and want to take me, I'm just like, okay, I want a plant this big and plant it, because again, immediate gratification, right? Now, I'm not sure if either one of you have heard or used this product, so it's maybe an unfair question. I seem to have good luck using Dr. Earth's antifungal sprays in my yard. How frequently should I treat lilacs to stay on top of powdery mildew?
I don't have any experience with that product.
So when I worked at a garden center up near Portland, and we sold a lot of that and had a lot of people with that same experience. I can't really speak to how to use the product properly. I think, read the directions on the label, ask your local garden center, but I would concur that I've met a lot of people who really love that product too.
Excellent. Is there anything else that either of you want to say about pruning? I kind of feel, oh, well, okay. Yeah. If there's anything else about pruning as far as different types, compact types, et cetera. And then I do have one more kind of related question about it.
I think the only thing that I would say is that sometimes it can be hard to bring yourself to do it, because if your plant is really, really beautiful and it's put out a lot of flowers, you're thinking, oh, wow, that's a lot of work. But it does help the plant save energy if you do get to it right away, just because then it doesn't have to devote the energy toward those spent flowers, and it can put the energy back into itself, doing something productive. So if that helps you, get out there and do it.
Yeah, and remember, really old wood, that we were talking about the new growth on the older wood, and just that if you notice your flowers are getting smaller and smaller, that's an attribute of older wood flowers. And so that's another reason to prune as well, because then your flowers are going to rejuvenate and become bigger, and be a little bit nicer.
So one of the questions, I said it was related to pruning, maybe not. Are lilacs a good candidate for bonsai?
Oh, why not?
Yeah, why not? I would argue that there are some really beautiful, like very sculptural looking lilacs that I've seen. I will also say that some of those are 300 years old. So do with that what you will. It is a legacy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that would be really neat. If you do it, I'd love to see photos.
Okay, so whoever asked that question, make sure you get back in touch with us or post some photos of your bonsai lilac on our social media accounts or something. That would be very cool. What about other uses? Cut flowers. Do you recommend it? I'm just going to say when I do it, I must be doing something wrong because they just don't last any time. So my attitude
Oh,
is kind of like, okay, I'm just going to enjoy them out in the garden and not bring them inside, but tell me what I'm doing wrong.
oh man, there is yes, a big yes to a yummy bouquet of lilacs. Essentially, and I think this would probably be worth putting in an email for your listeners, just so it's a very easy list to follow through. But yes, and you're going to want to do it in the morning because that's when they're going to have hold the most water. I think sometimes you think of it when you can get to it, but if you get to it later in the day, they're a lot more likely to flop when they're in an arrangement. And you're going to choose flowers that are half open and half still buds. That just extends their vase life and it makes this worth it. You're also going to want to remove all the leaves because that is extra work for the plant to keep looking nice. And those flowers are obviously very showy. So you're going to want to take all that extra work off. And there's a really cool technique that one of our friends, her name is Danielle from North Lawn Flower Farm. She's a great cut flower grower, but she has this technique where you can cut up the stem about 2 inches and then do it again the other way. So when you look at it from the bottom, it's kind of like a little X. And that just helps the stem absorb a lot of water. So you're actually able to get that plant to absorb a lot. And if you're really into having cut flowers in your house, then you're probably going to want a hydration product. So you just use that, you dip your little stems in it, and it would help the plant to stay free of debris and air bubbles so that the stem can draw up water as efficiently as possible. I love cut flowers so much. So I'm sorry, Georgia, I just hogged that because I'm like,
I think
everybody
that's
needs to
great.
have the most beautiful lilacs. So forgive me, but add anything that I missed.
No, I think that was the perfect answer. And you've taught me something about cut flower, so that's great.
And this shows how nice lilac lovers are and how generous they are in giving other people time on the webinar. That's so sweet of the two of you. Now I'm going to answer this next question just because it's well, it was asked excuse me, about edible lilac flowers. And I just have to say that here at National Garden Bureau, we don't like to, kind of take a stance on that because you never know what was put on your flowers. So we don't know if you have been growing them organically or if your neighbor sprayed something that's going onto your yard. So we just prefer to not really go there with making any kind of recommendations. So sorry, we can't give more information on that one. Any other uses though for lilacs? I mean, you guys have probably seen tons, millions, hundreds of lilacs over your careers thus far. So what's some really cool maybe design tips or planting tips? Where should they be planted in multiples? Or, what have you seen as far as mixing species or colors? Anything you want to share about design and planting fun things?
You go first, Georgia.
Okay, well, we talked about tree forms and patio tree forms, and that's one that I really love, and I love them in containers, actually, like planted up, and purples in the garden are so fabulous to me. And so playing off that purple, drawing in with other fragrance like lavender and maybe some silvers. I just think there's a lot that can be done with that color. And because it's full sun, it's a great container plant, whether that's temporary or full scale. But I love the new dwarf compact varieties in those containers. I think they're wonderful.
I think probably one of my favorite ways to use lilacs in the garden is the most cliche, but it's in those areas where they're very high traffic and you're like near windows so that you can build the romance into your own life. Open the window, read a little book, let the scent of a lilac waft in the window, or put it near a walkway that you traverse very often, or where you hang out with your guests. Because I mean, fragrant plants are probably one of the #1 memory makers for us gardeners. You kind of remember spending time in your friend's garden or your grandma's garden, or you want to build memories with your grandchildren or your children. So putting them somewhere that you can really enjoy that, like POW, is my biggest consideration for where a lilac should go. I also just thought, oh, it would be really fun to like press a lilac and then see how it worked as a stamp. Maybe it wouldn't be great, but also maybe it would be really beautiful, like flower confetti. So.
And somebody else brought up sachets. So they've got the
Oh.
fragrance. So put them in
Yeah.
sachets. That would
Yeah,
be
great.
awesome. Okay,
Mhm.
somebody's really going to challenge you to name your favorite cultivar.
Oh gosh.
That's like naming a favorite child, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's just so many. I'm really love this isn't full, but we just did a video about this in our Oregon nursery the other day, and it was so stunningly beautiful. So this is my favorite right now, Little Darling. But I really love the Bulgaris, the big, beautiful Bulgaris types. You know, we mentioned like Sensation. It's a great plant. And I really love the bicolor flower that it has. So I guess it just depends on what's blooming at the time.
Right, your new favorite happens and you're like, you walk, oh, hello again, friend.
That's it.
I would have to say my favorite is one that I've actually mentioned. It's the Syringa Hyacinthiflora. Our Centaura Double Blue is it's very fragrant. So obviously it ticks that box, but it's also really beautiful when you go up to look at the flowers. They look like they're doubled. So there's a lot of little intricate detail in there that makes a great cut flower as well as just a great garden plant. And it's a zone 8, so a little bit warmer. Not that I need it because I live in Michigan, but it's nice.
Speaking of the warmer climate, somebody did ask and I forgot to answer it earlier, or somebody asked and I forgot to re-ask it earlier. So the plants that are zone 8, or somebody had said they found one in California, will they be as fragrant as the ones in the northern climates? Does the temperature affect the fragrance?
So you might even enjoy the fragrance a little bit more because the fragrance of lilacs is a little bit stronger when the temperature is higher. So
Interesting. I didn't know that.
the opposite of what you've worried about.
Exactly. Yeah. And here in Chicago, we got to 91 degrees yesterday, so, and the lilacs are in bloom. So it's like, oh, yeah, I should have gone around and sniffed lilacs yesterday. I would have had a good bonus. And one or two of you had mentioned about growing in containers, and we talked about overwintering in containers, but just overall, any tips when you're putting a small compact shrub in a container? You know, like you relate the size of the container to the size of the shrub in any way? Any special tips on the potting soil that you use or anything? I thought we should include that in our discussion.
Yeah, I would always recommend a bigger size pot, especially for shrubs and trees and any of the things that are going to be there. You're thinking for a longer season. The bigger the pot, the better. Also, you want to make sure you're doing a potting mix and not garden soil. Garden soil is a little heavy and it's meant to have nutrients, you know, being sort of a living thing with the other soil around it. So you really want a potting mix that can give your plant what it needs as far as fertilization. And make sure it has drain holes. That's
Absolutely. Always needs drainage.
And I would also add that if it's going to be in there for a number of years before you kind of take it out and rejuvenate it, give it new soil, to remember to add some fertilizer, just because it might run through what that potting soil had available. Something granular would be great because then it can actually it's less likely to burn a sensitive shrub. But also it'll be there for a little longer, which is nice.
And so I'm looking back at some of the questions from earlier. I seem to have missed one. They're asking about breeding work on lilacs with She called it decent fall color. I didn't want to sound offensive, but and
You
maybe
don't like
I'm
the muddy yellow? Huh. I'm just kidding.
so that is the question about any plans on breeding a lilac with prettier fall color.
Always. The sky's the limit.
Yeah, we're always trying to find, I mean, the best plants are the ones that look good over the longest season. And so, yeah, I mean, if there was a lilac that we could breed with that had great fall color, we would definitely want to explore that option for sure. Yeah.
Okay, I think unless anybody has another question, it looks like I have gone all over all the questions that we had prior and questions that were asked here. So in the remaining 2 minutes, so that means like 1 minute for each of you, do you have can you recall like your favorite lilac memory and maybe how old you were? Like what was it that just made both of you want to garden with lilacs and work with lilacs during your career?
That's a tough one, Diane. Let's see. I grew up in Nebraska, and so we had lots of lilacs, and I remember lilacs in my grandma's garden and in my mom's garden, and not one specific memory, but I think just having those as the backdrop. Christina talked a little bit about that fragrance as the backdrop to memories, and I think that whether subliminal or not, played a huge role in where I am today, probably.
I wouldn't say it's a childhood memory, although my childhood was filled with beautiful plants. But lilacs specifically, I worked at the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island in Michigan when I was younger as the head gardener there. And my favorite memory was when the lilacs were in full bloom, and I would get to do a garden tour past like this 300-foot long section of massive old lilacs, which is where I get my love for massive old lilacs. And it was so intoxicating. It was definitely what made me want to plant lilacs in my own garden when I got to have a house. And it's just such a great plant to build memories around. And I don't know, who doesn't have a place in their heart for a gnarly looking old plant?
That smells
And
wonderful.
of course, our beautiful new plants as well, which is what I have planted in my garden, which
Yes.
someday will have some gnarliness to it.
Yes, excellent. Okay, so before I close, I think there wanted some clarification on the reblooming lilacs. So you prune the dead flowers after the first bloom, prune or deadhead, and then you also deadhead after the second bloom, correct?
Correct.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
And that also will help your plant. They're not particularly beautiful when they dry. A lot of times I love to encourage people to leave their dried flowers. So like for a panicle hydrangea, something like that, that has really beautiful dried flowers for winter interest. But for a lilac, they're kind of just weird looking. And if you get heavy snow, it's better to remove like some of those snow gathering points so that your branches are less likely to snap if they gather ice or heavy snow loads. It's just a tidier look. So
Just part of garden maintenance. So excellent. Okay. Oh my goodness, you guys were such a delight. This was so fun. Who knows that we would have this many questions about lilacs, but I think with your tips and your expertise, we are all going to be more successful in our gardens and enjoy our lilacs even more while we're out there trimming and deadheading after each bloom time. I appreciate it. I thank you, Georgia and Christina. You're welcome back anytime. So we're going to find more topics that you guys can come back on. And for everybody else, we have recorded this and we'll send it out to you so you can rewatch. And I think we had one thing we were going to follow up on, and we'll put that information in the email as it comes out. So thank you, everybody. Get out in your garden. If your lilacs are still blooming, go enjoy the fragrance and have a great day.